when we read the end of Joshua, we read that Joshua dies. He died at 110, which is old, but it's not as old as Moses. So he's not quite Moses, but he's close. They buried him in his own property, which is in Ephraim. Unlike Moses, we know where Joshua is buried. We don't know now where he's buried, but we did at some point. And he's buried on his own property. He's not buried. He's not buried in a national cemetery. He's not buried at a national monument, if you will. We have a equivalent of that, of course, in this country, which would be what? What would you say is the national burial site? Somebody?
Arlington?
Yeah. Arlington is our national monument. And Israel has one too, by the way, in the modern nation of Israel. Does anyone know? Because we always take people there. Somebody who's been on our trips or has been there before? Anybody?
I've been there, but I can't remember the name of it.
Sure. Well, it is Har Herzl, Mount Herzl, which is where they took, and I say they, the Israeli government took and buried Theodor Herzl from his original grave in Europe. They brought him to Israel and buried him, and then buried all the leaders of Israel around him. So Golda Meir is there. Yitzhak Rabin has a beautiful monument, burial place next to his wife. His wife is next to him. Menachem Begin is there. Yitzhak Shamir is there. A lot of the leaders of Israel are buried there, and the heroes of Israel. Hannah Senesh was buried there after she was murdered, and her body was brought back to Israel from Europe. But you know who's not buried there? David Ben Gurion is not buried there. David Ben Gurion is buried on his kibbutz, and so that's where he wanted to be buried, and that's where he is. It's Sde Boker. And so that was a little bit of a Joshua move on his part, which is to be buried in his home territory, if you will, rather than in a national place. And I'm sure that was a conscious decision on his part after reading the Bible and being familiar with these kinds of leaders. So, he really saw himself as a Moses or a Joshua. And so he was buried there. We know that there were burial sites for the early kings of Israel, David and his family. There were burial sites in Jerusalem for the kings of Israel. But then there were people who decided that they didn't want to be buried in a place like that. They wanted to be buried, not the kings, but other leaders, prophets, and as we're going to read, judges who are buried in their home territory, which again kind of shows a little bit more of tribalism too, a little bit more of the maybe we're a nation, but maybe there's something special about our nationality and our tribal place. George Washington's buried at Mount Vernon, right? So there is something biblical about that. So that's where he's buried. We read about the death of Eleazar, who's Aaron's son, the next generation of priests. He's taken over by Pinchas. And we also read, as we, again, to remind people of the burial of Joseph, who died hundreds of years before, but whose burial also takes place. So the book of Joshua ends with three burials, essentially: an ancient return of Joseph, and then these two leaders of the next generation, the generation after Moses, and Aaron, by the way. So the death of Joshua and the death of Eleazar are really the death of Moses and Aaron, the leaders, the next generation of leaders. So that is the death that happens. But what also we read at the end of Joshua is this message that Joshua says to the people, put away your alien gods. Are you really ready to do this? Are you really ready to continue on without me? And the other message that he also said to them, which was not only destroying the Canaanite gods, but right here, this idea of when he tells them their history, right before that, actually, Hold it one second. Here you go. He actually says to them, hold it a second. Oh, here it is. It's the beginning of 23. It says, I've given Moses, much later, sorry, the Lord had given Israel rest from all the enemies, and Joshua was old and advanced with years. And he says, I'm old and advanced with years. You've seen all that God has done. I've allotted you all that, all this land for your tribes. And the Lord your God will thrust them out on your account and drive them out as you account. But again, don't intermingle with these people. Don't serve. Don't bow down to their gods. But there is this sense that they haven't finished the job of driving out these nations. And that's the theme that we have in the book of Judges, is that the next part of our history is what happens when this doesn't go the way that Joshua tells them to go. So the chapter 1, which we're going to read now, Francine, are you online? You came on and then you left. Are you there?
Yeah.
Can I wish you Mazel Tov with everybody else right now? Yes? No? Yes? Are you there or not? You're muted. Okay. When you unmute yourself, we'll ask you if we can. Anyways, she's muted. So, she's chatting right now. Hold on a second. Let's see. Okay. Can we wish you Mazel Tov? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mazel Tov to you, Francine, for the birth of your granddaughters.
Thank you.
Congratulations, everybody. Wish her Mazel Tov, everybody. Mazel Tov to Francine. Thanks for coming on this morning. We know you're excited about your new status as a grandma.
Yes, I am.
Welcome to the club.
What?
I said, welcome to the club.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it is a club. It's another stage,
Yeah.
So,
well, we hope you enjoy your life now with a new generation of women. You were part of, you were started out with you and your sister, and then you had boys, and now hopefully will have another round of women in your life, because you had twin granddaughters born. So you have now a generation of women. So we hope that you help raise them up as strong women. So it's exciting.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Francine.
Thank you. I was trying to get my screen to come on, but for some reason, wait, here. There.
All right.
There.
We'll wish you Mazel Tov in person, hopefully soon too.
Thank you.
It's a great early Hanukkah gift. Anyways, so the book of Joshua begins with the words that kind of like take us back to the beginning of Joshua. Before we get into this too much, people ask, do we know who wrote the book of Joshua? There are different theories. There is of course the theory that it's a combination of a few different authors, maybe not many authors, by the way, but maybe a couple different hands at work here. But it's also a possibility that it was the work of one author, or somebody who edited together a few different stories, but essentially one author or editor who puts all of it together. It's not really a big issue for it, because there is a theme throughout this book, which is that the Israelites are living in a time when they can't get their act together. They'll have a problem. They'll pray to God. God will send a deliverer. The deliverer will help destroy the enemy, and then they'll go back to screwing up again. And so it's just a cycle. It's a rinse and repeat cycle. So let's take a look at, we're going to read the first few chapters again here today, and then we'll pick it up again next week. We'll be reading one of my favorites and one of your favorite stories, I hope. If you haven't read it, I think it will be the story of Deborah. But anyways, let's start today with the introduction, and we'll read about the first few judges and explain how these judges worked. So let's take a look. Rosemary?
Now, after the death of Yehoshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanite first to fight against them?
That's the Canaanites. Yep.
Why did they suddenly switch to Hebrew names when they've been?
I don't know what happened with this translation. My guess is that this is like more of a Jewish translation, and they felt more comfortable going with a Jewish translation. But you're 100% right that you're going to see things in here that you didn't see as far as the translations even in Joshua. That you'll see things like Canaani instead of Canaanites, or you'll see Yehoshua instead of Joshua. I think it's partly because people are not as familiar with this book, and to use a more like Jewish translation of it, people can get away with it without feeling like, what are you talking about? Because people haven't read it. But you're right, it is a little jarring to notice this. So here you go.
And the Lord said, Yehuda shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. And Yehuda said to Shimon, his brother, come up with me into my lot that we may fight against the Canaani, and I likewise will go with thee into thy lot. So Shimon went with him. And Yehuda went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaani and the Perizzi into their hand, and they smote of them in Bezek 10,000 men. And they found Adoni Bezek in Bezek, and they fought against him, and they smote the Canaani and the Perizzi. But Adoni Bezek fled, and they pursued after him and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and his great toes. And Adoni Bezek said, 70 kings having their thumbs and their great toes cut off gathered food under my table, as I have done, so God has requited me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Now, the children of Yehuda fought against the Jerusalem and took it, and smote it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. And afterward, the children of Yehuda went down to fight against the Canaani that dwelt in the mountain and in the Negev, and in the coastal plain. And Yehuda went against the Canaani that dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron before was Kiryat Abara, and they smote Sheshai and Yahiman and Telmeh. And from there, he went on against the inhabitants of Devir, and the name of Devir before was Kiryat Sefer. And Caleb said, he that smites Kiryat Sefer and takes it, to him will I give Aksha, my daughter, to wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him Aksha, his daughter, to wife.
Well, hold on one second.
So that's Caleb, right?
Let's just take a pause right there. So one of the first things we notice right here is this seems to be a totally different account than we have in the book of Joshua for what happens with the war against the Canaanites. There doesn't seem to be this focus on Jericho and on the first few places that we read about in the book of Joshua. You know, when we read the book of Joshua, we read about the campaign against Jericho and against Ain. And all of a sudden here, it's like the tribe of Judah goes up first with Shimon, the other tribe that's in the south, and then defeat these places. And not only do they defeat these places, but they defeat places that the Bible, that Joshua previously said that they didn't take, including Jerusalem. And so there seems to be this war against Jerusalem that the Judahites roll that we don't even have. So there seems to be this kind of story in here that it's a different account. It's almost like if you didn't have the other account, you'd say, oh, well, okay, this kind of makes sense. But we have another account we just read that doesn't say this. So look, I mean, it's possible, and people have said that maybe Judahites did go to war against Jerusalem, drove out the Jebusites, and then they come back and they reestablish themselves. I mean, that's possible, but it just almost seems like there's a whole different thing going on here. We also have this story about Caleb promising his daughter to whoever conquers that town, Kiryat Sefer. That we had that story. We did have a version of that story in
Wait a minute, he married, does this say that he married his niece?
correct. Yes. Correct. No, he married his cousin.
Ah.
Othniel is the son of Kenaz. So Kenaz is Caleb's younger brother.
Okay.
And so, Othniel and Aksha are cousins. Completely legitimate marriage in Jewish law, and actually not uncommon. So we did have a version of this story before. We don't have their names. We don't have Othniel's name, and we don't have Aksha's name either. And what are these? What are the purposes of these stories? What are the reasons that we have these stories here? It does seem like these are kind of explanations for how these tribes wound up with the property and the territories that they had, but also how like some individuals or some families wind up becoming the leaders. And so there's definitely something here about kind of establishing how different people and different tribes wound up with what they had, which, okay, so the stories are somewhat can be contradictory. There's not a lot of that. There is some, though, and this is a perfect example of something that's contradictory. But what's interesting about it is, if we kind of step back and say, why do these stories exist? They exist to explain why the way things are the way they are. And later on, there is no doubt that Jerusalem is under control of the Judahites. It's actually the capital of the Judahite kingdom, right? It's David's capital. And so the idea that Jerusalem has some connection to the Judahites is very important. And then, and so this is part of kind of like explaining the way things are maybe later on, but skipping over maybe other parts of the history of it. So we have that sometimes in the Bible, and we have that even going back to Genesis. As I think about it, as we discussed some of Genesis in the last few weeks, it's very prevalent in Genesis as well, where you say, well, why does that story exist? To explain why things are the way they are now. All right, so here's the story of Othniel.
And it came to pass, when she came to him, that she moved him to ask of her father a field. And she alighted from her ass, and Caleb said to her, what wilt thou? And she said to him, give me a blessing, for thou hast given me a Negev land. Give me also pools of water. And Caleb gave her the upper pools and the lower pools.
And this is the story that we read earlier in the book of Joshua just a few weeks ago, right? So we read about this. I mean, we read this story. I mean, this story exists in the book of Joshua, where she says to her father, you gave me this land, but there's no water for this land. Give me. And so this is an explanation for why an area is part of a city where maybe it wouldn't have been a part of the city, but they needed the water from that other place in order to live there. So again, this is we have a version of this story in Joshua.
And the children of the Keni, Moshe's father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Yehuda into the wilderness of Yehuda, which lies in the south of Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. And Yehuda went with Shimon his brother, and they slew the Canaanite that inhabited Zaphat and utterly destroyed it. And the name of that city was called Hormah. And Yehuda took Azah with its border, and Ashkelon with its border, and Ekron with its border. And the Lord was with Yehuda. He drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moshe had said, and he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak.
So we're reading about the Judahites' conquest here, which is again a little different than what we read in Joshua, but generally, I mean, some parts of it are consistent, and the bigger issue of what we're reading about seems to be an admission that again there were places that the Israelites couldn't conquer, in particular areas where there were urban dwellings where people had chariots and defense that they couldn't conquer. So assumedly, again, the places that were up in the mountains that were not, people didn't have chariots, and they had maybe less infrastructure, less walls. Those areas they conquered, but the areas in the valley they had a hard time with. So here's an admission, the fact that they couldn't dwell out, they couldn't get all the dwellers of these areas out. So here it says that they took Azah and Ashkelon and Ekron, which are Philistine cities on the coast, and modern day Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and up to Ashkelon, which is in Israel. So these are areas that the book of Judges says that they took, which later on we know in Judges are inhabited by the Philistines, including people like Goliath. And it says here too that the
Are
people,
these mountainous regions?
no, well, some of them are, right. Some of Judah is on the east side. That's mountainous. But as you get into the plains and you get into the valleys, no, these aren't. These are
So
areas.
Ashkelon, is that a mountain or is it a
No,
valley?
it's a coast. Ashkelon is right. Ashkelon is one of the closest cities to Gaza that's in Israel. It's the largest city. So most of the areas around the Gaza are kibbutzim and moshavim. They're farm areas, places like Sderot that are in the news a lot because they get bombed all the time. But this Ashkelon is in Israel. It's just the closest city to Gaza, and so it's oftentimes also hit by rockets, missiles, and it's a city with big buildings and tower apartments and things like that. So that those are scary targets.
Would have had chariots on the coastline. They would have used iron chariots.
Well, those are actually that says in the valleys, which could go up to the coast, but those are flat areas. So these are areas that are flat that you can have chariots on. So it's not necessarily beach. All of it is beach, right? So part of the area of Ashkelon, where you're on the beach, then you wouldn't use a chariot. But up until that point, you could have roads, and there were coastal roads, and obviously still are coastal roads that are, that you can put chariots on, that you can, obviously nowadays the equivalent of driving cars on. But yeah, it's not.
I was just trying to picture the type of war.
Yeah, you have to be careful with it because it's susceptible to earthquakes and liquefaction. So areas along the coast are sometimes a little hazardous, but of course they're beautiful and they're wanted for coastal trade and those kind of things. So these are all areas in Judah, in the tribe of Judah. Francine, your son Joey lived in Ashkelon. Are you still there, Francine?
He lived in Ashdod.
Oh, he lived in Ashdod too, yeah.
He lived in Ashdod by the sea.
Is closer. Yeah, it's just up the road from Ashkelon. That's right. So Ashkelon, yeah, I don't want to scare you that he was that. What Ashdod is still pretty close to Gaza. So it goes as
Oh,
you
yeah.
if you're going up the coast from Gaza, Ashkelon is 5 miles, 4 miles. Ashkelon is 4 miles from Gaza, the tip of Gaza, and then Ashdod is another 3 miles, 3 miles past. So let me just show you a quick.
Yeah, he experienced, I think he experienced some things when he was there, with the Palestinians sending rockets.
Yeah, so Ashdod is a little bit further up, but yeah, we're not talking about too
Yeah.
far. Let me just show this real quick. I'll show you what we're talking about here. This is Gaza right here. This is Gaza. This is the northern border of Gaza. This is Sderot. This is the closest town to Gaza. So this area gets hit all the time. And this is literally just like a mile away from the border of Gaza. So that's Sderot. But if you go along the coast, here's Ashkelon, which you can see is, the border of Ashkelon, like the town is here and there's Gaza right there. And then you go up to Ashdod, which is right here, which is about another 2 or 3 miles north. So it's literally the difference between Santa Monica and I wouldn't say Venice, but Santa Monica and Marina del Rey, maybe. No, that's not a good example. Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
Westchester?
Yeah, Westchester, yeah. So you go to Ashkelon and Ashdod, and this is only like 10 miles, not even 10 miles from here to there. And then you go further, you get Bat Yam, which is the next kind of city that's along the coast. And then you get to Yaffo and Tel Aviv. So we're not talking like miles and miles between here. This distance would be the distance from Long Beach to Santa Monica, from Tel Aviv, Yaffo to Gaza. We're only talking about 15, 20 miles along the coast, and then you have all these cities. Now, all of these cities right here along the coast, these were all Canaanite cities. So Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod, which again, partly is in Israel and partly is in Gaza, these were Philistine cities. And the Philistine territory was here. We're going to read about in Judges, and then sometimes it goes all the way out to here. As the Philistines kind of like expand, they expand into Israel, into Judah, particularly into Judah. Philistines aren't really a northern tribe problem. Like if you're from Ephraim, you're not caring that much about the Philistines. But if you're from Judah, you're really caring about the Philistines, because if the Philistines decide to expand, they're expanding into your backyard. The other piece we want to remind people is these Kenites, these Kenny are not Canaanites. These are Cani, which is interesting because it's actually similar or connected to the name for Cain, for Cain. So it's closer. Canaan is a different word, a whole different word, different letters. But Cani is actually close to the name for Cain, which you don't get because there's a Q here. But the Keni are actually, as you can see, they're from the tribe of, or the people of Moses' father-in-law, which mean that they're Midianites. They're a Midianite tribes people who've attached themselves to the Jews. And so they live amongst us. They're they're second-class citizens, folks. They are kind of treated as outsiders amongst us. And there's always some suspicion about them and about their religious observance and their real status as a part of our people. But the Midianites, we do know, are descendants of Abraham, so they're not that different, but they are different enough. And so the Judites deal with them, and in particular, and I guess there's a question of whether they're Midianite or whether they're Israelite, and so this is, this is where we are. So we said that it could not drive them out. It says here, he expelled them and the 3 sons of Anak, the Anakites. This is also a reference to Goliath's people. So Goliath is an Anakite, or a descendants of these Nephilim, these giants. The Anakites are Canaanites by nature, And so they're not actually, like, Goliath wasn't a Philistine according to the Bible. He was a mercenary or a giant in the employ of the Philistines, but he wasn't a Philistine himself. The Philistines were Aegean peoples. They were Greek, if you will. They spoke a Greek language, and they were Greek culture. They brought Greek culture, Aegean culture. I wouldn't call it necessarily Greek yet, but the Aegean culture they brought to Israel, to that coastal area. They I guess it could make sense that they hired out giants to fight for them. And in this case, he's an Anakite. He's a Canaanite. So the interesting thing about Goliath, if you will, is that he's not a Philistine. He works for the Philistines, but he's not a Philistine by ethnicity, but by employ. Yeah, he's working for the Philistines. But so does David for a little piece of time that we're going to get to. So the Philistines sometimes used the local Canaanite or Israelite population for soldiers. All right. So that is the Anakites. All right.
And the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Yevusi that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Yevusi dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day.
So that's kind of weird, because right there in the same chapter, it says that the Benjaminites didn't drive out the people in Jerusalem. So how could both of those things be true? They again seem to be different versions of essentially the story, but at least according to one story, the Jebusites never got driven out, and they still live in Jerusalem, and we let them live there. So you have the Judites, you have a little bit of the Benjaminites here, which of course is a little bit of a condemnation of the Benjaminites for not driving out the Jebusites. And now we get to Joseph.
And the house of Joseph, they too went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph sent to spy out Bethel. Now the name of the city before was Luz. And the scouts saw a man come out of the city, and they said to him, "Show us, we pray thee, the entrance into the city, and we will deal kindly with thee." And when he showed them to the entrance of the city, they smote the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go free.
Oh, that's a nice story. It's a story of, again, using local spies or the local inhabitants, and it happens. It happens on both sides. It'll happen to us occasionally, where we'll have informers or people who will rat us out, and we actually have, unfortunately, some of those stories in the Roman era, where we have Jews who aided and abetted the Romans in their capture of the Jewish people and Jewish rebels. And unfortunately, my friends, we have horrible stories of this that went on during the Holocaust, which are now in some cases being told. The dark side of these stories, where we had Jews that in some cases informed on other Jews in order to keep their position of power and influence and to stay alive. It's not a really, I mean, I just read about one that happened in Salonika, in the Sephardic community in Salonika. There was a really not good story about a Jewish person who turned in Jews. And of course, that happened in Berlin. There were whole groups of Jews that somehow were able to make it through the war by turning in other Jews to the authorities, and it's touched on briefly in the movie The Good German with I can't remember right now, but it was George Clooney movie. But it's a story about the war, right after the war in Berlin, and that there were Jews who informed on other Jews, and so it happens on both sides, and it's this story must have captured people's imagination, where you have a guy who ends up like we read about Rahav, who helps us and who we spare for that. So, and we also read about the brutality of battle, where we cut off people's thumbs and toes and mutilate them rather than kill them. So, but as you read in that story, the guy who gets mutilated says, I used to do that to people and now I'm getting mutilated. So there was that little karmic payback, if you will, for him. All right, so let's keep going.
And the man went into the land of the Hittim and built a city and called its name Luz, which is its name to this day.
So the guy ended up going back to Canaanite, Hittite area and built another city with the name of the old city for Bethel. There's still a Luz. It's just not, it's new Luz, if you will. And it was built by that guy who we let live. Yeah.
Did you say when they use the term to this day, does that mean it's written in a certain time period, or what does that mean?
It's a great question, yeah, and we will see it. We will see it a few times in the book of Judges, where people literally, when you see these terms, you go, well, when did you write this? So yes, when you see terms like that, and in Judges, I'm not ruining the story for you, that occasionally we'll get a line which there was no king in those days. Well, okay, I guess there's a king now then. So when you see those terms in the book of Judges, or again, even we have them even in Genesis, where it says the name of, we actually have a discussion of Luz in Genesis, where it says that Jacob calls the place Bethel. It was originally called Luz. So this idea that we renamed Luz to Bethel is a big issue in the Torah, and the Bible keeps coming up. But yes, we'll occasionally get those statements that are kind of anachronistic, or at least tip your hand to, oh, you mean this wasn't written when it happened, or at least it wasn't edited together when it happened. And that's one of those places, which is, as it was known in those days, or as it is still is to this day, it kind of tells you that we're reading something that was written after the fact, well after, in some cases, well after the fact. Okay, so let's keep going.
Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bet-Shan and its hamlets, nor Tanakh and its hamlets, nor the inhabitants of Dor and its hamlets, nor the inhabitants of Yivleam and its hamlets, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo and its hamlets. But the Canaani persisted in dwelling in that land. And it came to pass, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaani to tribute and did not utterly drive them out. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaani that dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaani dwelt in Gezer among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nahalol, but the Canaani dwelt among them and became tributaries. Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, nor the inhabitants of Zidon, nor of Alav, nor of Aksiv, nor of Helba, nor of Aphek, nor of Rehov. But the Asheri dwelt among the Canaani and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out.
Yep, let's keep going.
Neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Bet Shemesh, nor the inhabitants of Bet Anat, but he dwelt among the Canaani, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Bet Shemesh and of Bet Anat became tributaries to them. And the Amori forced the children of Dan into the mountain, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. But the Amori persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Ayalan, and in Sha'alvim, yet the hand of the house of Yosef prevailed, so that they became tributaries.
One more.
And the border of the Amori was from Ma'ala Akrabim, from the rock upwards.
Yep. Now, we read these lists of the tribes that we just read through these last 10 verses or so, and we read about the Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Zebulun, Ephraim. We didn't read about, by the way, the Gadites and the Reubenites and those people on the other side. We also didn't read about the tribe of Issachar, but we read about most of the tribes. We also read about the Kenites, that are actually almost like a sub-tribe amongst us. it's kind of interesting that this list, what is in this list and what's not in the list. Okay, you've now read this list of the cities or the tribes, the area that the tribes had, and what they did and what they didn't do. So you see a couple themes in here. What's one of the themes that we have here in the first part of Judges? What's one of the themes?
That they left a lot of Canaanites alive.
Yeah. Yeah. That they left a lot of Canaanites alive. And in some cases, all they did was take tribute from them. They allowed them to live, which is not what Joshua told them to do. It's not what Moses had told them to do. And they let them live, and they left them alone. But there does seem to be something really interesting, which is that when you look at what happened with these tribes, the northern tribes, and you looked at what happened with the tribe of Judah, there seems to be a huge pro-Judah bias here, which is the Judahites did a really great job of reading their area of people, right? Judah go up, and Judah went up, and he went and delivered the Canaanite, and they smote them 10,000 men, and they fought against them, and they caught him, and they killed him, and then this guy, they killed him, and they go ahead and he smote everybody, and he gives Kiryat Sefer to his daughter, and all this stuff, and like he didn't drive out the inhabitants of the valley, but pretty much everything else, and that's now the Benjaminites, everything else they seem to have done, and they couldn't drive out these people. But it doesn't say that they let them live. It doesn't say that they took tribute from them. It doesn't say they, like kind of just lived in the status quo. The pro-Judahite bias in this is pretty noticeable. And again, some people have pointed out, like, what's going on here? Why did the Judahites come out so good and the rest of the tribes don't come out so good? Which again, some people say, well, it's written by somebody from Judah. But I think there really is this kind of explanation for why in certain areas there were more Canaanite cities than there were in other parts. Now, it could also be that the Canaanite base of operations, if you will, their main cities were in the north, which makes a lot of sense. And so the Judahites could have been better militarily or whatever. They could have been more successful, but it also could be that, that it was just harder in the areas that the northern tribes lived, which were primarily plains, flat areas, not as hilly, that it was harder for them because they had so many people that were living in valleys that they had to deal with. So, it could also be that, like, they didn't necessarily it's not that they were less competent than their Judahite brothers, cousins, if you will. So keep that in mind, that, again, the topography of Israel is different.
I'm thinking it would be like fighting in Afghanistan, right? These are a lot of little tribes in mountainous valleys and hills.
Yes, but for the Judahites that conquered those places that were hilly, they had a better time of it because they were able to conquer those areas. The areas in the north of Israel, like Megiddo and in the Jezreel Valley, that those areas would have been hard for them to capture because they were inhabited by Canaanite warlords, city states that were fairly strong. And so it could also be, again, just the fact that this was harder areas for them to capture. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's easy for the Judahites to maybe capture their areas, and even they weren't 100% successful. They weren't able to drive out the people in the valley. And it says why, because they had chariots of iron. So if those chariots of iron exist in the Jezreel Valley and some of those other places that the Israel tribes had to deal with, of course they had the same issue, except they had it, and that area was much, each of those tribes was much smaller than Judah, and essentially they had a harder job per capita or per square mile, whatever you want to call it. That they had just a different topography. So what we're going to read about in the book of Judges, a lot of what we read in Judges takes place in that northern area. It takes place in those tribes in the north which were, at least according to Judges, and again, maybe because of the topography and because of just the cultural, the situation there, those were harder areas for the Israelites to conquer. And so when we read in the next week, when we read about the story of Deborah, we're going to read about one of those wars that took place in the north, in the area of the northern kingdom, what would later be the northern kingdom, but the northern tribes. So unfortunately I have to run now. I have a funeral now. We're going to get into the story of Deborah this next week, and we're also going to read about Ehud and one of the early judges, and then we're going to be in chapter 4. We're going to be reading about Deborah, who's one of my favorite heroes, and I think will be one of your favorite heroes too. If you don't know about Deborah, you'll have a chance to read about her next week in chapter 4. So again, thank you, everybody. We have Wendy is leading services on Friday, so we're hoping everyone can join us. We're going to have a happy hour before, and Mike, let me tell you, Wendy is going to be definitely doing more of a traditional service. I'm not saying Mike in particular. Mike brought up that point, but
well, she always does.
And so she actually made a point of telling me yesterday when we talked about the service that she's going to do a lot more. So again, everybody, take care, stay healthy, and again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Rosemary, for reading, and once again, very, very happy moment for day for yesterday for Francine, and we wish you lots of mazel, lots of good things, and continued blessings, especially to you. All right, and to everybody, but especially to you on this great transition, and enhancement for your family. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.